Okay, good evening. It is time for Chapter 2 of The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution by David Bryan Davis. This one is going to be a shorter read than the first one was. Um, all right, so it is titled The Seats of Power 1. Chapter 3 is The Seats of Power 2, so makes sense, right? All right, here we go. Prospects for Reform. A modern-minded reformer living in the 1770s might sum up the prospects for general emancipation somewhat as follows. In the absence of full-scale insurrection or civil war, there will be little likelihood of persuading governments to take positive steps towards emancipation in regions dominated by the plantation system and dependent on slave labor. Even where slavery is of marginal economic importance, it will be sheltered by a concern for the rights and security of private property. An era of revolution may have begun, but revolution assemblies will generally be in the hands of merchants or landed interests imbued with a commercial spirit. Such groups will be acutely sensitive to any precedent that might harm traders, investors, and property owners, or to any threatened tax increases for poor relief or for compensation payments to slaveholders. In many areas, white workers will threaten violence if faced by the competition in free Negro laborers, and as Benjamin Franklin cautiously warned, quote, slavery is such an atrocious debasement of human nature that its very extirpation, if not performed with solicitous care, may sometimes open a source of serious evils, end quote. On the other hand, human bondage seems to contradict the ideals of liberty and natural rights that are used to justify revolution. In almost any assembly or convention, some delegates will be deeply troubled by official tributes to liberty that disguise quiet sanctions for slavery. Others will view involuntary labor as a source of economic backwardness or of military insecurity. With sufficient skill, organization, and perseverance, such reformers might exploit their ideological advantage and achieve some form of gradual emancipation, at least in countries where the entire social and economic system has not been assimilated to slavery. But even this realistic appraisal fails to convey the true complexity of the question. To understand the first great political struggles over slavery, one must move beyond a simple dichotomy of quote unquote economic motives and quote unquote humanitarian ideals. In the broadest sense, there can be no doubt that differences in economic structure and development governed and with governed the political response to slavery. No representatives of a plantation regime took serious moves toward a general emancipation. No northeastern United States legislature contemplated a commercial boycott of the West Indies in order to disengage themselves from the slave system. Yet it is fruitless to debate whether the northern states abolished slavery out of economic interest or whether Virginia slaveholders were sincere in their professed belief in natural rights. In Virginia, the hegemony of a planter class set definite boundaries to the most sincere idealism. In the North, where there were many slave owners but no distinct slaveholding class, idealism could serve a variety of purposes and mix freely with objectives unrelated to social justice or the future status of the Negro. If there is no convincing evidence that slavery was unprofitable in the northern states or was dying there from economic causes, the institution hardly meshed with the ideology of Poor Richard's Almanac. That's the title of a book. The emerging consensus ruled that slave labor stifled the progress of industry and the mechanical arts, and as John Adams shrewdly observed, the white working man's hostility toward Negroes could find an outlet in opposition to slavery as well as in racial persecution. Yet slavery was always a potentially explosive problem because it raised fundamental issues few leaders were prepared to face, even in a revolutionary age. Through much of American history, the shadowy presence of the slave was an irrepressible reminder of the systematic violence and exploitation which underlay a society genuinely dedicated to individual freedom and equality of opportunity. The entire rhetoric of liberalism reassured individuals that their own true freedom could not run counter to the best interests of anyone else, but the connection between slavery and economic success dramatized contradictions in the very meaning of liberty. And because debates over slavery allowed conflicts in values to be fused to specific conflicts of interest, they gave a moral and ideological dimension to struggles for prestige, material advantage, and power, especially in national conventions and congresses made up of widely divergent interest groups. The question of slavery could become a testing ground for disputes over representation, jurisdiction, and limitation of power. It could provide the basis for compromise or a vulnerable target for dissident and rebellious groups. In the United States, a series of compromises on slavery became the fulcrum of an uneasy balance of power. In Britain, the triumph of the anti slave trade movement signaled a redefinition of national interest. In France, anti slavery and anti colonialism became ideological weapons in the contest for revolutionary leadership. Excuse me. Emancipation in non slave societies. Chapters 2 and 3 are mainly concerned with the political implications of anti slavery doctrine as as embodied in the compromises and commitments of national lawmaking bodies. But virtually all the emancipation acts from the American Revolution to the Latin American Wars of Independence issued from local assemblies which subscribed to a liberal ideology but which also had some slaveholder representation. To put the national conflicts in proper perspective, it is well to look first at the difficulties and delays in securing emancipation, even where slavery was unpopular and relatively insignificant. Emancipation could never be the simple matter of a legislature decreeing that after a certain year all slaves should be free. The absurdity of this notion becomes clear as soon as one thinks of the obstacles any modern government would face if it decided to outlaw a long accepted species of private property or of labor use, say even a declining practice like the employment of domestic servants. No New World government had experience in eradicating an institution, let alone the bureaucratic machinery to let alone the bureaucratic machinery to deal with the variety of legal and extra-legal subterfuges that could prevent effective implementation of a manumission law. Successful enforcement lost my spot there for a second. Sorry. Successful enforcement would require the strongest support from public opinion. Yet even the Quakers, with the most powerful religious sanctions and the most delicate social instruments of persuasion, had a long and difficult time ridding their own sect of slaveholding. On the assumption that the American Revolution brought a smooth and relatively unopposed end to slavery in the northern states, historians have sometimes asked whether, with a little additional effort, the line of freedom might have been extended to the border of South Carolina. Much has been made of the plans of men like Thomas Jefferson and St. George Tucker for the gradual emancipation and colonization of Negroes. This apparent liberalism has seemed more promising when coupled with Virginia's allowance in 1782 of voluntary manumission and with the bold struggle against the legalization of slavery in the Kentucky Constitutional Convention. But even if we disregard evidence of slavery's continuing and growing strength in the Upper South, such stirrings seem less hopeful when placed within a larger comparative setting. Consider first the caution and conservatism of Northern legislators. In 1780, the New Hampshire legislature debated and then postponed the apparently touchy question of manumitting a handful of slaves after receiving an eloquent appeal from Negroes, quote, that the name of slave may not more be heard in a land gloriously contending for the sweets of freedom, end quote. The constituent conventions of both New York and Massachusetts defeated attempts at constitutional emancipation. Again and again, the legislatures of New England, New York, and New Jersey rejected even the most cautious proposals for gradual abolition. Although by 1800 there seemed to have been fewer than 50 slaves in the province of Lower Canada, its House of Assembly refused as late as 1803 to pass bills for gradual emancipation. In 1780, a group of Pennsylvania radicals secured the first emancipation law in the New World. The Philadelphia radicals, though politically opposed to the Quakers, fulfilled the Quakers' goal as proof of their own revolutionary sincerity, as a means of winning divine favor, and as an expression of gratitude to God for the British evacuation from their city, an event which had incidentally led also to the exodus of many Negro slaves. The law applied only to future generations of Negroes. By postponing their emancipation to the age of 28, it promised to compensate owners by having young servants earn the cost of their own upbringing. Even so, a rural faction within the radical party strenuously resisted the measure. The law's defenders succeeded in defeating attempts to repeal and attempts at repeal and emasculation, but were unable to accelerate progress with the subsequent act for total abolition. The pattern was similar throughout much of the North. In the absence of legislative action, judicial decisions eroded the institution fairly rapidly in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, but at a slower pace in Lower Canada and the Maritime Provinces. From 1784 to 1804, gradual emancipation acts won grudging assent in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Upper Canada, New York, and New Jersey. As one might expect, the legislative contest was easiest where the proportion of Negroes was small. Yet even in Upper Canada, where there were a few hundred slaves at most, the law of 1793 provided freedom only for post nati at the age of 25. The House of Assembly, which contained loyalist slaveholders who had fled the United States, prohibited private manumissions unless a master could provide security against his Negroes becoming a public charge. Under New York's first Emancipation Act of 1799, all existing slaves were to remain in perpetual servitude. As an additional compensation for post-nate emancipation, the law allowed masters to abandon bondsmen at any time and thus to transfer the cost of rearing Negro children to the towns and ultimately to the state. Only in 1817, and after a bitter legislative struggle, could Negroes born before 1799 look forward to the promise of freedom after enduring still another decade of slavery. New Jersey's abolition law of 1804 was so conservative and slow in operation that the state still contained slaves, euphemistically defined as apprentices, at the time of the Civil War. The problems raised by freeing some 11,000 blacks in New Jersey seem insignificant when compared with those faced by the British government at the time it was drafting a plan for the emancipation of 780,000 colonial slaves, or by the Russian government in 1861 when emancipating 22 million serfs. Moreover, during the last 2 decades of the 18th century, many more slaves were voluntarily manumitted in Virginia and Maryland than were affected by the emancipation laws of states like Connecticut and Rhode Island. In some respects, the laws may have made little difference. In Delaware, for example, where the legislature spurned a gradual emancipation bill in 1786, slavery declined such much as it did in New Jersey, until by 1860 free Negroes outnumbered slaves by 10 to 1. In view of these considerations, the conservatism and continuing resistance in the northern states seem all the more striking. Yet, even apart from racial prejudice, contemporary social values provided little justification for the rehabilitation of the ex slave. Excuse me. In no state or colony were there effective institutions for the support or education of slave children. At a time when the rights and status of the free laborer were increasingly uncertain, the future role of the freedom could arouse only the gravest misgivings. And in Latin America, despite vast differences in social structure and cultural heritage, one finds the same story of slaveholder resistance, concern for property rights, and delay in implementing high sounding pronouncements. As in North America, revolutionary ideals had more decisive effect where slaves were few in number. With less than 4,000 Negro bondsmen, many of whom were employed as domestic servants, Chile can be roughly compared with a northeastern state. Yet in 1811, attempts at gradual emancipation met stiff opposition from both rebels and royalists. The Constitution of 1822 declared all Chileans equal before the law, but it was not until the following year that the Senate, after much debate on the possible threat to property rights, finally agreed to general emancipation. In 1824, the National Assembly of the United Provinces of Central America also passed an immediate abolition act. But this celebrated law freed no more than 1,000 slaves and still aroused long preliminary dispute over compensation, legislative jurisdiction, and the danger of antagonizing Cuba, Jamaica, or independent slaveholding nations. The Mexican Constitution of 1824 evaded the question of slavery, notwithstanding Republican enthusiasm over recent military victories and an act by the Constituent Congress outlawing an already defunct slave trade. Mexico finally abolished slavery in 1829 by a decree of the dictator Vicente Guerrero. I probably mispronounced that, but whatever. In the face of a Spanish invasion, and the government allowed Texans the subterfuge of classifying their slaves as indentured servants. Progress was considerably slower in Venezuela, where the proportion of slaves in the total population was slightly smaller than in New York. In 1786, slaves constituted 7.9% of New York's population. In 1810, the number of Venezuela did not exceed 5%. In Venezuela, as in New York, revolution led to stirring demands for slave emancipation. Both both patriots and loyalists exploited the grievances of Negroes, and independence brought to power a conservative, commercially oriented elite. There, however, the similarities end. If Venezuela had become less dependent on slave labor with the decline of its cacao plantation economy in the 18th century, a coffee boom beginning in 1830 increased the demand for some form of involuntary servitude. Nor could the white elite ever forget that the mass of Venezuelans were non-white pardos, a lowly caste that shared much in common with the Negro slaves. There were local circumstances then that enabled a powerful pro-slavery faction to dominate the Congress of Angostura in 1819, defeating Simon Bolivar's pleas to implement earlier wartime promises of liberty. A decree of January 1820 called for gradual instead of immediate emancipation, on the ground that it would be necessary, quote, to make them men before making them citizens, end quote. Yet this pronouncement carried no enabling legislation. It was only after independence and prolonged debate at the Congress of Cucuta, Cucuta, I don't know, Cucuta with an accent, that an emancipation law finally emerged. And despite the noble rhetoric accompanying it, the 1821 Cucuta law carefully guarded security and property rights by requiring slave children to serve their mother's owner until maturity, by granting local boards the power to determine the freedmen's future occupation, and by making the emancipation of adults depend on monetary compensation to be raised by a special inheritance tax. Since this cumbersome measure was to be administered by local juntas, which were often not appointed, slaveholders faced no immediate menace. A succession of idealistic decrees failed to raise the taxes for compensation, to unsnarl litigation, or to subdue mounting public resistance. In the province of Bogota, with Venezuela part of Gran Colombia, only 22 manumissions were recorded in 1822 and only one in 1823. In La Guaria, the law freed 7 slaves in 1823 and 1824. Although the numbers soon increased, the expansion of coffee plantations brought an increased demand for labor and even an illicit revival of the slave trade. Compared to the northern United States, the Latin American republics faced insuperable obstacles to effective abolitionist legislation. Long dependent on Spanish administrators and imperial institutions, they lacked the strong traditions of local government essential for carrying out legislative reforms. Moreover, soon after independence, they became almost wholly preoccupied with domestic disorder and civil war. It is not surprising, therefore, that in Venezuela, as in Colombia, Argentina, Paraguay, and Peru, slavery remained legal until the mid 19th century. Yet, from a comparative view, one is most struck by the approximately 36-year duration of gradual emancipation in territories as economically and socially diverse as New York and Venezuela. Nor can the chronology of final emancipation be explained by either the number of or concentration of slaves. Negro slaves Negro slavery was technically legal in Canada for 7 years and in Connecticut for 21 years after it had been outlawed in New York. The institution ensured in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and most of the Latin American republics long after it had been abolished in Haiti and in the British West Indies. I'm sorry, I said ensured. Endured. I don't know where I got, well, I know where I got insured, but that makes a lot more sense when you read it as the institution endured. Anyway, sorry about that. From a realistic viewpoint, it is perhaps absurd to speak of the slowness of gradual emancipation. From 1780 to 1850, the New World witnessed a remarkable expansion of free soil areas, leaving only Cuba, Brazil, and the southern United States as bastions of a once universal system. Nevertheless, the history of this expansion suggests the magnitude of resistance to peaceful and gradual emancipation in the great plantation societies. Petition and representation. The fates of anti-slavery in the Age of Revolution hinged on the debates and decisions of 5 great deliberative bodies: the British Parliament, the French Constituent and Legislative Assemblies, and the Constitutional Convention and Congress of the United States. Before these assemblies took up questions relating to Negro bondage, anti-slavery appeared to be one of the many harmless philanthropic fashions of the late Enlightenment. one which could only attract sympathy on the level of abstract principle from benevolent planters and hard-headed politicians. But in the brief period from 1787 to 1794, anti-slavery became linked with major controversies over petition, representation, government jurisdiction, and sovereignty. The commitments and compromises growing out of these struggles helped to define the channels and limits of future abolitionist activity. Obviously, the great assemblies differed widely in their relationship to the people and in their responsiveness to public opinion. France had no tradition of government by consent of the governed. For at least a century, the British Parliament had been conceived as a supreme authority, independent of shifting public opinion, but capable of governing in the general interest because of its indirect or virtual representation of particular interests. In the North American colonies, as Bernard Bailyn has pointed out, representatives had traditionally been thought of as attorneys of the people, continuously accountable to their constituents and obligated to follow public instructions for promoting and defending the interests of their localities. In the period from 1787 to 1793, the assemblies of France and America faced revolutionary crises and struggled to formulate law and write constitutions in the face of hard demands from shifting groups and alliances. The American leaders succeeded in stabilizing their revolution and framed a constitution that satisfied large segments of the public that had had no part in drafting it. France was imperiled by counter-revolution and foreign invasion. Under the mounting pressure of peasant uprisings and urban mob violence, her revolution moved rapidly from a parliamentary regime that would preserve vestiges of the past social order to a republican convention theoretically based on the sovereignty of the people. Meanwhile, British politics moved sharply to the right. After flirtations in the 1780s with proposals for moderate parliamentary reform and for amplifying the public's voice in government. By 1793, the official view held that any expression of political opinion through spontaneously formed associations was criminal and dangerous to the state. On any conventional scale of radicalism and conservatism, it would appear that anti slavery would face far greater obstacles in Britain than in the United States, and would win easiest acceptance in France, which did, after all, succeed in abolishing serfdom, uh, seigneurial rights. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know that word. It's Seigneurial. If anybody knows the word. Hey Vesper, how you doing? So I stopped in the middle of that sentence. Sorry. So it would win easiest acceptance in France, which did, after all, succeed in abolishing serfdom, seigneurial rights, and the entire feudal system without compensation. But conventional scales can be misleading. All five assemblies contained minorities that can be termed anti-slavery in the broad sense, that they favored restricting the slave trade and laying the foundation for gradual emancipation. But since anti-slavery in this general sense amounted to little more than personal disposition, it cut across lines of party and faction, providing no basis for unity when other issues took precedence. The five assemblies also contained influential members who directly profited from the slave trade or plantation agriculture. They too were divided by interest as well as faction. In France, for example, the quote unquote colonial interest included royalists as well as Jacobians. merchants who insisted on retaining a French monopoly on colonial trade, as well as absentee proprietors who sided with the colonists' complaints against the mercantilist system. On one issue, however, these various groups could unite, drawing support from more neutral factions that feared national ruin. No reforms could be allowed to weaken or undermine the slave plantation system, and the more critical and domestic divisions, the more imperative the and the more the domestic division the I screwed it up again. And the more critical the domestic divisions, the more imperative that demand became. Sometimes I just cannot read. Good just has to short because the cop. Okay. Had to cut your walk short because the cops drove past. Oh, they thought you were out casing the joint, huh? In France, anti slavery literature had stirred the hearts of philosophes, journalists, and the more enlightened nobility, including such imposing figures as the Marquis de Lafayette, the Duc de la Rochefoucauld d'Enville, and the Comte de Mirabeau, all members of the Société des Amis de Noir, familiarly known as the Amis de Noir or the Amis, the Friends. But this philanthropic group, formed in 1788 upon the urging of British Quakers and based on a literary ideali- idealization of the Quakers of Pennsylvania, lacked the perseverance, the organizational ability, and the communications network of the British and American Society of Friends. Yeah, you live in a pretty safe neighborhood. Yeah, but yeah, it is. It's easier to just not have to deal with cops at all if you can help it. In 1788, British sanctions seemed to be an asset rather than a liability. Brissot de Warville, the Society's principal founder, had first offered to serve as the French agent for the London Abolition Committee, which had declined to give him financial aid but had encouraged him to form his own organization. Brissot continued to hope that the two societies could be officially affiliated in order to create a more favorable public opinion, and because of circumstances which he dared not put in writing to his British correspondents, arising from l'ordre de I'm not I, l'ordre de choses nous existantes. My French is so terrible at this point. It's been 35 years, so don't know at all what that says. In the summer of 1789, the London Committee did send Thomas Clarkson to Paris to help the Amis de Noir, but by then even informal association was becoming an embarrassment to both parties. On August 18th, Etienne Clavière sent an urgent message to his friend Brissot. Uh, J'ai appris here à Versailles que l'on avait fait parvenir something about government, la vie, donc something about two societies. Again, I know I'm butchering it so bad. I'd rather just try to translate it. Something blah, 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 Saint Domingue. So we read about Saint Domingue, the island or the settlement, in the first chapter. So something about government and societies in Saint Domingue. Um, the Ami suffered. Oh, maybe let me see if there's a 12. He doesn't really do translations here. He gives big long notes on them, but not translations of what it actually says. So, oh well, we'll just move on. The Ami suffered other weaknesses besides the suspicion of treason. They published an elaborate 46-page preamble and constitution, which suggested, as later confirmed by Etienne Dumont, that that their meetings would be formal and tedious, discouraging attendance through sheer boredom. They could claim as members many nobles of high rank, men of the royal courts, bankers, farmers general, society women, nominally even the king, people whose pre revolutionary influence did not help the later anti slavery cause. Following the English example, the Ami originally fastened their hopes on the goodwill of government. Ministers like Loménie de Brienne and Jacques Necker, Lafayette, who seemed to be slated to become the French Wilberforce, succeeded in winning Brienne's qualified approval of the organization, but with the warning that the Amis should show the utmost prudence in their meetings and writings. No doubt the government would have suppressed the society if it had formed auxiliaries in the provinces and had seriously agitated the third state. In any event, though Lafayette and Mirabeau helped to free anti slavery writing from censorship, the public remained profoundly ignorant of and indifferent toward colonial issues. If the call of the Estates General had not presented new opportunities, the Ami might soon have faded into oblivion. Brissot often Brissot, after organizing the society, had sailed off to the United States with no intention of ever returning. What brought him back was the news of an exciting political crisis which offered the chance to lobby for a variety of reforms. Early in 1789, the Marquis de Condorcet wrote addresses on behalf of the Ami to all of the bailliages of the realm and of the corps electoral, urging France to follow the noble example of the Americans, who had realized that they would debase their own cause of liberty if they sanctioned Negro slavery. And we have another long quote in French. I'm not going to even attempt. Um, I can catch a few words of it. Abolition of the Negroes in the United States. Um, poli- Something about politics and justice, honor, humanity. Uh, Declarations of something or other. Liberté. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I wish my French was good enough to try to even begin reading that, but it's, like I said, haven't studied it in 35 years, or, yeah, thereabouts. So, partly in response to the Amis appeals, 49 of the some 600 general uh, cahiers de doléances. Um, I also sucked at French even when I was studying it, so um, called for abolition of the slave trade or for gradual emancipation. 29 of these came from the clergy or nobility. The anti slavery Cahiers represented most parts of the kingdom. By some mystery, Bagneres, a remote village in the Pyrenees, demanded a total eradication of colonial slavery, yet this hardly amounted to an impressive upswell of anti-slavery opinion, nor were the Kahirs reinforced by continuing public agitation. Indeed, by December 1789, the provinces received a circular letter charging that the Amis, the Friends, had been instigated and financed by the English, and that they had already sent agents to the West Indies. Uh, something about the blacks and the whites. I don't know. Um, in the first months of 1790, before the Assembly committed itself to a policy of non interference, there were some 24 petitions supporting the slave trade. Not a single French city asked for its abolition. Even if anti slavery had won more popular support, there were powerful forces in favor of suppressing political discussion. The slave trade itself may have been peripheral to the French economy, confined to a few port cities and controlled largely by Protestants who had closer ties with Dutch financiers than with the rentiers and proprietors of inland France. Man. Nevertheless, informed contemporaries agreed that the slave trade was more vital to France than it was to England, a belief which raised suspicions of English backed philanthropies. The merchants and artisans of the port cities also insisted that the colonial trade was the indispensable foundation of national prosperity. More ambitious young men, noble as well as bourgeoisie, um, a few years in the West Indies had long been an accepted route to fortune or a means of replenishing a family's diminished estate. Despite their differences on other issues, a substantial number of merchants and colonial landowners sensed a common peril when Kahirs demanded interference with the slave system. In 1789, anonymous letters threatened that if the Ami did not disband, the members would all be stabbed to death. William Short wrote Thomas Jefferson that he had heard that the first member of the Assembly to make a motion against the slave trade would be promptly assassinated. The rumor had supposedly frightened Mirabeau. As it turned out, the pro-slavery factions had no need of terrorism. The Constituent Assembly refused to consider addresses against the slave trade submitted by the Amis de Noirs, although the latter could claim at least 17 nominal members in the Assembly. As lobbyists and propagandists, the Amis were no match for the urban chambers of commerce or for the various organizations of merchants and planters whose members swamped assembly delegates with petitions, pamphlets, and personal remonstrances. The main result of the Amis' petition was to convince their opponents that even disputes over colonial representation and mulattoes' rights concealed secret designs to subvert the slave system. These issues later became the first major battleground, but for the moment the Assembly's Committee on Colonies, under mounting pressure from pro-slavery lobbyists, decided to omit from its initial report any recommendation that the Assembly give future attention to slavery or the slave trade. In early March 1790, Pétion de Villeneuve had prepared an extremely cautious speech asking that the Assembly appoint a committee to investigate the most prudent means of ending the slave trade and ameliorating the condition of colonial slaves. But on March 8, the Assembly approved the report of the Committee on Colonies, which affirmed that the government had no intention of furthering innovation in any branch of colonial trade, and which also outlawed any agitation that might endanger colonial property. Thenceforth, the committee refused to consider anti-slavery petitions. The assembly barred the subject from floor debate. The Amis vainly protested that they were in the vanguard of the revolution. Um, Another French quote, something about despotisme et inexorable. Um, I don't know. I don't. Uh, Moving on, but they faced a new despotism that was more repressive than the old. The right and practice of petition were more firmly established in the United States than in France. Anti-slavery ideals aroused more widespread public support, but since the southern states were deeply committed to a labor system that had begun to disappear from the North, anti-slavery petitions provoked an ominously sectional conflict of interest. Excuse me. Southern delegates could argue persuasively that, given such marked sectional differences, loyalty to the Union should take precedent over the right to petition. There was, of course, no metropolitan center that could serve as a focal point for national agitation. The decision to move the capital south from Philadelphia underscored the sectional character of Pennsylvania's abolitionism. I shall postpone discussing the consequences of this dilemma, but may now point out that even Benjamin Franklin thought it prudent to suppress a strong anti-slavery memorial he had been asked to present to the Constitutional Convention, nearly half of whose members owned slaves. A petition to the first Congress from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, signed by Franklin as the society's chairman, unleashed angry and uninhibited debate. In 1792, however, Congress returned to its clerk a mild abolitionist petition from the Quaker Warner Mifflin, after Representative William Smith, a South Carolina Federalist, had warned that the right to petition could not justify the, quote, mere rant and rhapsody of a meddling fanatic, end quote, the very reading of which would prove highly dangerous. In the British Parliament, defenders of the slave trade tried similar tactics, but were overwhelmed by a rising tide of petitions and an unprecedented arousal of middle class opinion. In June 1788, the Earl of Carlisle could express astonishment over the Lord Chancellor's sarcastic reference to quote a 5 days fit of philanthropy, end quote, when everyone knew the slave trade, quote, had engrossed the attention of every part of the kingdom for above these 12 months, end quote. The British abolitionists' success in mobilizing public opinion was all the more striking because governments had not yet become seasoned to national petition campaigns organized by pressure groups as an alternative or supplement to persuasion through personal influence. When confronted by radical political agitation in the early 1790s, Parliament could contemptuously dismiss petitions for constitutional reform and attempt to suppress such supposedly subversive groups as the Manchester Constitution Society. In 1793, the Earl of Abingdon warned that the abolition movement also drew on, quote, Tom Paine's Rights of Man for its chief and best support, end quote, and that it carried, quote, seeds of other abolitions, different and distinct from that which it professes, end quote. Yet the opponents of the slave trade took pains to make their campaign respectable. They observed established procedures in gathering petitions, avoiding, for the most part, promiscuous public meetings. They did, it is true, adopt the radical step of publicly testing candidates for Parliament by their stand on the slave trade issue. Sir William Young, a West Indian proprietor, complained that in counties with large electorates, they introduced leading characters, quote unquote, to influence the multitude. He also charged that abolitionists exploited the rotten boroughs in procuring petitions. But Young himself represented the rotten borough of St. Mawes in Cornwall, and the truth was that both the slave trade and slavery depended for support on the landed interest and the traditional system of representation which allowed the purchase of rank and political influence. Any abolitionist movement backed by organized public opinion was an indirect attack on the reforming parliament. This fact helped to account for the abolitionists' continuing failures. The British political system was flexible enough to permit abolitionist controversy and yet to contain it within the boundaries of the existing order. In England, the public clamor against the slave trade far surpassed the relatively faint anti-slavery stirrings in France and the United States. In Parliament, unlike the National Assembly and Congress, abolitionist petitions led to intensive investigations and continuing debate. The cause found eloquent champions among the leaders of opposing parties, including the Prime Minister William Pitt and his great Whig rival Charles James Fox. Given this sanction, defenders of the slave trade could neither stifle discussion nor bury the question in a committee on colonies, though they did for a time bury it in the House of Lords. On the other hand, the abolitionists, anti, an, anti the anti-abolitionists controlled the procedural routes to legislation, and since their numbers included some of Pitt's most powerful friends and supporters, they could prevent the cause from being advanced as a government measure. Although the West Indies had no formal representatives in Parliament, Charles Fox remarked in 1796 that if ever a region had been quote unquote virtually represented, it was the West Indies in the House of Commons. This truth did not mean there was a solid and invincible West Indian interest of merchants and planters, nor did the continuance of the slave trade depend on the votes of the relatively few members who drew personal profit from slave ships or West Indian estates. In the 1790s, the loose anti-abolitionist alliance included the king and royal family, the admirals of the navy, leading commercial interests in London, Liverpool, and Bristol, and above all, many landed proprietors who feared any innovation that might weaken the empire, raise taxes, or set a precedent for more dangerous reforms. In the long run, however, the system of virtual representation provided tenuous protection for the West Indies. The slaves were, quote unquote, represented in Parliament only in the sense that, as capital, they gave added political power to absentee owners and commercial interests dependent on their produce. But this kind of representation would also diminish if the West Indies declined in their relative value to the British economy. Moreover, the custom of absentee ownership, which was the key to the island's virtual representation, removed from local leadership the wealthiest and most successful planters. Many of the most influential spokesmen for the West India interest in England had never seen the West Indies. They were happy, of course, to draw income from slave plantations so long as profits were forthcoming and the plantations were not too heavily mortgaged. But unlike the resident slaveholding class, they were part of a larger social order and could easily assimilate the changing social norms of the English gentry. Meanwhile, the West Indian legislatures increasingly fell into the hands of small local merchants and members of the managerial class, men who lacked both power and prestige in the eyes of the British elite. Therefore, when the West Indies lost much of their supposed virtual representation in Parliament, they had no constitutional protection against newer and more vigorous interests, except for their vain appeals to the theories of plural sovereignty and limited parliamentary jurisdiction. appeals which had originally been developed by their former rivals on the North American continent. Political independence gave Southern slaveholders the chance to build permanent constitutional barriers against such an erosion of political power. Howard A. Oline has recently pointed out that the agreement to count 3/5 of a state's slaves in apportioning its number of congressmen and presidential electors, quote, was the major instrument in uniting slave and non-slave states in a national legislature that represented a significant advance over the static form of English constitutional structure. Slavery and the fears of slaveholders acted to assure a more democratic political system for white men. End quote. I don't know if I said where the beginning of the quote was. Anyway, one should add that the use of slaves to augment the political power of an entire region also gave non-slaveholding Southerners a political stake in the slave system, while confirming their independence on slaveholding leaders. Confirming their dependence on slaveholding leaders. In the 1780s, slavery was by no means extinct in the middle Atlantic states, yet 90% of the nation's blacks lived south of Delaware. In only 5 of the original 13 states was the institution of central economic importance. Accordingly, slaveholders might find themselves at a disadvantage in assemblies like the Continental Congress and later the Senate, where all states had an equal vote. But in 1790, and presumably earlier, the total population of the southern states was roughly equal to that of the northern states, and was thought to be increasing at a more rapid rate. If slaves had been counted as the equivalent of free men, the South could have claimed nearly 50% of the seats in Congress. If slaves had not been counted at all, the South would have been entitled to only 41% of the seats. As Oline makes clear, virtually all the delegates at the Constitutional Convention assumed from the start that slaves would be counted in apportioning both taxes and representation. They differed on the political weight to be granted to small states and on whether Congress itself should have the power to set future formulas for representation as a means of protecting existing interests against geographic shifts in population and wealth. Once the convention had rejected the principle of state equality for the lower house of the legislature, the question came down to how slaves should be counted in determining representation, whether implicitly as property or explicitly as a fixed proportion of the population which the House of Representatives should directly mirror. Paradoxically, Oline writes, quote, it was the issue of how to count the, paradoxically is the beginning of the quote. Sorry about that. Paradoxically, it was the issue of how to count the slaves that became the means of assuring that representation would be regulated by a census beyond the control of the national legislature. Because Southerners came to fear, as the debate developed, that if Congress fixed the representation, it might not use slaves to determine ratios in the future. End quote. That is an interesting. It's interesting that that quote comes up now, because that is exactly what certain parties are trying to do with the illegals that we have flooded into our country. They're worried they won't get to use them for further representation. There were complex maneuvers and alliances that led to this result, but the 3/5 rule, which had originally been used by Congress in 1783 in making requisitions for revenue, served the purpose of both Northerners and Southerners who wished to subordinate state sovereignty to a federal system of direct taxation and proportional representation based on population. It was James Wilson, a liberal Pennsylvanian, who used the three-fifths principle to win Southern support against the conservative and small state resistance to any radical transformation of the older Confederation. In actual practice, the three-fifths ratio did not fulfill Southern expectations. In 1790, the major slaveholding states had nearly 45% of the House seats. By 1820, because of an unexpected population increase in the North and Northwest, the number had fallen to 42%. Increasingly, the South looked to the Senate and to the admission of new slave states as its major line of defense, coupled, of course, with the constitutional rights reserved to the states. Nevertheless, by linking slaveholding to political power, the Three-Fifths Compromise provided far more substantial protection than the informal alliances which for a time shielded the British West Indies. It also presented a vulnerable target for political attack. I think we're down to the last few pages here for this chapter. Even during the convention, the general acceptance of slave representation could not subdue sectional fears and jealousies or disguise the deeper political implications of slavery. When delegates from the small population states saw the rejection of safeguards for their own interests, they objected that the proposed constitution would result in a kind of enslavement of the smaller states to the large. These complaints prompted Madison to suspend the pretense of sectional compromise and to observe bluntly that the really important divisions of interests resulted from the effects of, quote, having or not having slaves, end quote. If Madison aimed his arguments against proposals for state equality in the Senate, his tactics presupposed that Southerners would agree that state sovereignty was insignificant compared to constitutional protections for slavery. Following Madison's lead, Northerners like Rufus King merged the slavery issue with their own political interests, suggesting that the Northeast could not accept slave representation without concessions that would prevent a shift of political power to the Southern interior. These intimations alarmed the Southerners and helped to convert South Carolina to the doctrine of representation by population. For a time, the South Carolinians insisted that Negroes be counted equally with whites in apportioning representation, on the ground that, quote, the labor of a slave in South Carolina was as productive and valuable as that of a free man in Massachusetts, that as wealth was the great means of defense and utility to the nation, they were equally valuable to it with free men. End quote. Pierce Butler warned that Southerners would not confederate without the security of knowing that their slaves could not be taken from them, as he thought some Northerners, either within or outside the convention, had a mind to do. William R. Davie of South Carolina also flatly stated that without slave representation, his state could not remain in the Union. The Founding Fathers may not have seen the Three-Fifths Rule as a specific endorsement of slavery, but that was the clear interpretation of the more volatile Southern speeches. The Georgians and Carolinians tested the boundaries of Northern acquiescence and were satisfied with the result. During the 1790s, some Northern papers questioned, usually on political grounds, whether the Union was worth such a concession. When confronted by the acquisition of Louisiana, Rufus King complained that slave representation, one of the greatest blemishes of the Constitution, would never have been consented to if Northerners had foreseen that indirect taxes would be sufficient for raising revenue. The argument was questionable, but suggested a future alliance of anti-slavery and changing economic interest. Yet, unlike the planters of the Caribbean, Southern slaveholders held a fixed bastion within the national government. Their political power drew sanction from the supreme law of the land. The calling of the French Estates General led to disputes over representation somewhat similar to those in the United States. Yet the marginal position of the slaveholding colonies and their distance from the metropolis made them more analogous to the British West Indies than to the southern states. Aside from such abstract parallels, the French Revolution and the peculiar social structure of the French colonies soon gave conflicts over representation a character all their own. In the absence of a national parliament, the French slaveholding and slave trading interests had long had influence in the royal government, which had, for example, granted subsidies to the African slave trade and given planters limited permission to import foodstuffs from the United States. After the estates were summoned, the more conservative absentee proprietors opposed the idea of colonial representation. We may imagine that if England had been struck by revolution, British merchants and absentee planters would have had similar motives, a desire to keep the control of colonial legislation in the hands of the crown and to prevent the flame of revolution from spreading to the Caribbean. Even in the colonies, there was some sentiment against sending delegates to the Estates General, where they would be vastly outnumbered by a metropolitan majority that might be inclined toward commercial exploitation as well as interference with slavery. Some French planters, as potentially secessionist as many South Carolinians, favored creating an autonomous assembly responsible only to the king. But the ideas and watchwords of the Enlightenment had given an edge to the grievances of the divided colonial population. If the colonists had no feudal regime to overthrow, they had long resented mercantilist restrictions on trade and were well aware that the North Americans had not only freed themselves from similar restraints, but now offered attractive markets within the French government, which the French government would be determined to limit. Like their North American counterparts, many French colonists detested the royal bureaucrats and functionaries who tried to enforce imperial policy and who, unlike the British officials, appealed for support when crisis came from the mulattoes or sangmeles. The latter, who also approximated the whites in number, owned a sizable number of slaves and some of the finest plantations in the French colonies, yet they suffered the indignities and discriminations of an undercaste and looked for whatever protection they could find against the racism and jealousy of the petites blancs, the little whites. Um, The poorer whites not only coveted the property of the vulnerable mulattoes, but felt little deference for wealthy white planters who aped the manners of the French aristocracy. The slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity would have quite different meanings for these fragmented groups, and they would have a meaning altogether distinct for the Negro slaves who listened to heated political discussions or who, in the person of Toussaint l'Ouverture, even pondered the stirring and inflammatory words of the Abbé Raynal. At the outset of the Revolution, when deputies met in Martinique to elect representatives to the National Assembly and draw up cahiers de doléances, a bitter struggle erupted between planter and merchant factions. The planters, finding they would be outnumbered by their merchant creditors, demanded a new election in which 5 slaves would count as 3 citizens in apportioning representation. We are not told whether the Martinique planters who resolved to secede from the union with the merchants knew of the American compromise arrived at 2 years before. Unlike the Southern delegates to the American Convention, the deputies elected to the Estates General by wealthy Saint Domingue planters soon lost their mandate as the Petites Blancs, donning the red cockade, looked for a Bastille to storm, and as the mulattoes, Grands Blancs, merchants, and royalist government all became embroiled in a struggle for power. But meanwhile, the arrival of the deputies in France raised questions that echoed some of those recently asked in the Philadelphia Convention. Rebuffed by the first two estates, the colonists finally won acceptance from the desperate third, except for the sticky question of numbers. Mirabeau asked a new Constituent Assembly why a small white colonial population should have so many representatives. He was surprised to hear that slaves were counted in apportioning representation, on the excuse that they were instruments of wealth. If that argument were valid, why not count the horses and cattle of France? If wealth were the basis of representation, why should the delegations from the French cities be so small? Mirabeau also touched a point that would have been unthinkable at the American Constitutional Convention. Saint Domingue, he pointed out, contained a large population of free mulattoes, including men who owned property and paid taxes. Since these gens de couleur were barred from voting, how could the white deputies claim to represent the colony? Although the Assembly admitted 10 of the elected deputies, the debates on the colony's relation to the central government gave momentary openings for attacks on slavery and talk of eventual emancipation. The colonial deputies expressed alarm over such rhetoric. For a time, they considered schemes for bypassing the Constituent Assembly by encouraging their fellow colonists to submit independent constituent uh, independent constitutions to the crown. It soon became clear, however, that their safest course lay in an alliance with the Revolution and in working with other West Indian interests in a special committee on colonies. In many ways, the Revolution widened the divisions of interest, separating various groups of merchants and proprietors with West Indian ties. The colonial deputies backed the revolution and supported most of the reforms of the Constituent Assembly. The Club Massiac, or Corresponding Society of French Colonists, tended to be royalist and opposed to working through the Assembly. Even Jacobean merchants insisted on retaining the mercantilist restrictions which nettled the planters, but all these factions could applaud the efforts of the Club Messiac to expose and thwart the designs of the Amis de Noir, and all could unite against any threat to the security of the slave colonies. The issue precipitating this alliance seemed irrelevant to the slave system. Despite legal attempts to exclude them, many mulattoes lived in France. Some were wealthy, few, if any, opposed slavery. But like Mirabeau, they saw no reason why colonial representation should be confined to the white race, or why the Declaration of the Rights of Man should not bring equal citizenship to free men of any color. A group of wealthy mulattoes first sought backing from the Club Messiac. Some of the absentee proprietors, putting wealth ahead of color, recognized that granting some concessions to mulattoes might help subdue the revolutionary forces in the Caribbean. Many slave merchants were indifferent to question of race so long as their own profits were secure. God, I thought we were getting close to the end here. Yet most of the West Indians in France feared that any blurring of the color line would not only spark a white secessionist movement in the colonies, but would also seriously undermine the discipline of social controls of the slave system. The absentee proprietors therefore refused to heed the mulattoes' appeals. Like a mirage. Yeah, exactly. The colored delegates, encouraged by the Declaration of Rights of Man and by the subsequent Republican rhetoric, appeared before the bar of the National Assembly on October 22, 1789, petitioning to be seated as West Indian deputies. Although the Amis de Noirs had originally confined their objectives to ending the slave trade and to gradual emancipation, they now followed the lead of the Abbe Gregoire in championing the mulattoes' cause. Lafayette, Mirabeau, and Jerome Pétion joined Gregoire in demanding that mulatto representation be the prerequisite for settling colonial problems. But the connection between the mulatto question and half hidden anti slavery purposes aroused the planters and merchants who were otherwise divided over navigation laws, colonial autonomy, and the wisdom of forming a committee on colonies. The Amis were shouted down, outmaneuvered, and then distracted and divided by the supervening disruptions of revolution. Oh, we're near last page. The West Indian merchants and planters, supported by delegates from the great commercial centers, maintained a formidable alliance from the fall of 1789 to the spring of 1791. For a time they benefited from the mood of national crisis. If the mulattoes could brand racial discrimination as an indefensible violation of revolutionary decrees, Arthur Dillon, a deputy from Martinique, could warn the Assembly that the colonists would revolt within 15 minutes after hearing that the colored deputation had been seated. This would mean, he said, the loss of the West Indies to England in accordance with the designs of English conspirators who lurked behind the Amis de Noirs. During the same years, defenders of slavery used similar threats with similar effectiveness in the assemblies of Britain and the United States. And in all three countries, disputes over petitions and representation soon led to fundamental questions of constitutional jurisdiction and sovereignty. The end of the chapter. um, it was about 3 pages longer than I was thinking it was. So that will take us into chapter 3 for next time. I am not going to jump into another um, chapter at this point. We're an hour and 20 minutes into the reading, so we did pretty good. Um, all right. It's, yeah, it's 11 o'clock where I'm at. Um, I think I'm going to go ahead and head on over to Hot Dog Raw Dog for a few minutes to give him a couple viewers and say hello to him. So bear with me. I'll take us on over there. And you all have a nice evening, or late night, I should say.
second. Let me get you a shout out, good sir. I'm playing Resident Evil 2 Remake. I really, really like this. Oh, man. Okay, yeah, I have to step away from the mic for a second while I give you a shout out. So if my voice sounds a little different while I'm typing, I apologize. Meneth, Gilga, Lad. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, perfect. And you were streaming just chatting. Oh, okay. Were you doing another occult reading tonight? I really like your occult readings. By the way, if you're not following Meneth Gilgalad, please give him a follow. He's a fantastical streamer. And he plays a wide variety of games, very chill, very mellow. And he also does these occult readings in which he'll sit down and like um, he'll read stuff like 1984 and like really really good stuff. And definitely somebody that I recommend following. I promise that you won't be disappointed. So how was your stream, good sir? I hope it went well. And please don't worry if you have to raid and run, dude. I get it. Because streaming can be a bit exhausting at times, so no worries there, sir. Because I definitely understand, like, oh my gosh. I don't have a radiation suit. Am I going to be okay?